A ghost town summer at JFK Airport, empty gates, half-full jets, and no line at immigration. The Washington Post, July 2025. Canadian tourism to the U.S. plummets 70%, wiping out over 320,000 airline seats and billions in spending. Reuters, Q2 2025. It wasn't a war nor a virus, but by mid-2025, America's airports felt like both had struck. Across terminals from New York to Miami, passengers vanished, airlines canceled routes, entire sections of international terminals dimmed the lights, and the biggest shock? It came from just across the border. Canada, once the top source of international visitors to the US, had pulled back hard. What happens when your closest ally decides your country is no longer worth visiting? For decades, the US and Canada shared more than a border. They shared a tourism bond so strong it defied politics. Each year, over 20 million Canadians crossed into the US to shop, escape winter, attend concerts, or visit family. From snowbirds flying to Florida to college students on spring break in Vegas, Canadian tourists poured an estimated $22 billion into the US economy in 2024 alone. Their presence was dependable, welcomed, and rarely questioned. The relationship was built on ease, short flights, mutual trust, visa-free entry, and a sense of familiarity that made Canada feel like America's most agreeable neighbor and customer. But beneath the surface, something shifted. During Trump's second term, rhetoric toward Canada began to sour. Offhand remarks about Canada being America's 51st state, combined with sweeping tariffs and travel policy changes, began to stir resentment north of the border. By early 2025, that resentment turned into retreat. The U.S. increased visa scrutiny on travelers from several countries, and although Canadians were officially exempt from visa requirements, many reported longer inspections, heightened airport questioning, and an overall sense of being unwelcome. Simultaneously, Canadian media began amplifying calls to boycott U.S. travel. Reddit threads went viral. Influencers labeled travel to America as unethical. The sentiment grew. Visiting the U.S. was no longer just a vacation choice. It was a political statement. Airlines took notice. Tour operators adjusted itineraries. And by the time the summer of 2025 arrived, the friendly border had become a cultural fault line. What had once been a model of cross-border tourism now stood fractured. No walls, no bans, just silence on the jet bridges and empty terminals where trust used to be. The U.S. approach, policy, perception, and the politics of isolation. It began with policy, but what ignited the fracture was perception. Following his 2024 re-election, President Trump doubled down on a vision of American sovereignty steeped in control, tighter immigration, harsher trade barriers, and a reclaiming of U.S. cultural identity. Tourism, once seen as a soft power advantage, became entangled in hardline domestic politics. One of the first moves came through visa and border processing reforms. While Canadians remained exempt from traditional visa applications, airport procedures across JFK, LAX, and O'Hare became more aggressive. Reports surfaced of Canadian citizens, business travelers, students, even retirees, being detained for hours, questioned about political affiliations, and in some cases, turned away with no clear cause. It wasn't policy on paper, it was how it felt at the gate. At the same time, the U.S. slashed international tourism marketing. Brand USA's promotional budget, previously $100 million, was gutted to under $25 million. American embassies cut back on outreach, while global ad campaigns promoting destinations like Las Vegas and Miami disappeared from foreign TV screens. This vacuum left room for something else: backlash. The administration's stance on trade didn't help. Tariffs on Canadian lumber, dairy, and industrial materials triggered diplomatic tensions. The U.S. imposed a fresh round of tariffs in early 2025, referring to Canada dismissively in speeches and suggesting that it needed to play by the rules like a responsible state. Many Canadians interpreted this as a degrading reference to their sovereignty. The damage was swift. By March 2025, Canadian tourism numbers had dropped 17%. By June, the decline hit 70%. That figure translated to more than 14 million canceled trips, over 320,000 empty airline seats, and a collapse in revenue across border states like New York, Michigan, and Washington. Airports felt the vacuum. JFK reported a 26% drop in international arrivals. At LAX, nearly one-third of international gates sat unused on peak summer weekends. Terminal staff were quietly furloughed. Food vendors downsized hours. But the real blow came to the cities built on foreign visitors. Las Vegas hotels saw record vacancy rates, some casinos operating at just 48% capacity. In Orlando, theme parks cut seasonal hiring by nearly 35%, citing Canadian families as a missing segment. Miami Beach, once buzzing with international nightlife, had quiet Friday nights and rows of empty sun loungers. And this wasn't just about economics, it was symbolic. The US wasn't just losing tourists, it was losing its reputation as a welcoming nation. Despite reassurances from DHS that no official changes were made to Canadian travel, the lived experience at airports and consulates told a different story. Canadians weren't banned, they were simply discouraged. And in global tourism, perception is policy. Canada pushes back. Airlines, cities, and citizens choose exit. Unlike in previous trade spats, this time, Canada responded not through politics, but through people. Faced with rising US hostility, Canadian consumers took action with their wallets. Online, hashtags like #boycott USA and #travel elsewhere gained momentum. Travel influencers began publishing anti-itineraries, showcasing alternatives to US destinations. Skip Vegas, try Vancouver. Forget Florida, explore Portugal. The cultural shift was matched by economic withdrawal. Air Canada announced in May 2025 it would cut 40% of flights to US destinations, citing prolonged softening in demand due to traveler discomfort. WestJet followed suit, canceling routes to Phoenix, Nashville, and Boston. By summer, Canadian Airlines had eliminated more than 300 weekly flights into the US. The effect on Canadian tour operators was even sharper. A June 2025 industry report revealed that cross-border packages fell by 53%, replaced by surging demand for Europe and Asia. Trips to Japan, Portugal, Iceland, and Vietnam skyrocketed. For the first time in a decade, Bangkok received more Canadian tourists than New York City. And it wasn't just about price or policy, it was about principle. Canadians, known for pragmatic diplomacy, had begun framing travel choices as moral statements. Why spend your money in a country that doesn't want you there? Became a refrain in editorials, travel forums, and even airline ads. A prominent column in the Globe and Mail called the shift Canada's new quiet protest. The government took notice. Federal tourism agencies redirected campaign funds toward promoting domestic travel and international destinations outside the US. Provinces like British Columbia and Quebec launched programs incentivizing staycations and conscious travel. Meanwhile, Canadian airports adjusted logistics, focusing less on US-bound infrastructure and more on trans-Pacific and transatlantic capacity. Toronto Pearson added new gates for Europe-bound carriers. Vancouver expanded service to Seoul and Singapore. Even legacy partnerships began to strain. Joint US-Canada travel initiatives were quietly shelved. Shared customs pre-clearance programs slowed. Coordination on cross-border tourism security was frozen in bureaucratic limbo. And across Canada, there was a growing recognition that this shift might not be temporary. Airlines, tour agencies, and airport executives all confirmed the same trend. This wasn't just a blip. It was a structural pivot, one that could reshape travel flows for a generation. The world is big, Canadian travelers realized, and increasingly, America was feeling smaller. Gridlock in the skies, no war, no talks, no way forward. By the fall of 2025, the airspace between Canada and the US was open, but nearly empty. Officially, no one had broken ties. No treaties were torn up. And yet, the collapse of one of the world's most integrated tourism corridors was unfolding in plain sight. Major cities across North America were bleeding revenue. New York projected a $4 billion shortfall from lost international tourist spending. Las Vegas casinos slashed entertainment budgets. In Orlando, theme parks quietly paused expansions. But no formal talks were scheduled. No leaders met to discuss restoration. Diplomats whispered of tension behind closed doors, but the silence on public channels was deafening. The tourism gridlock was compounded by aviation retreat. Play Airlines of Iceland withdrew entirely from the U.S. Lufthansa canceled routes to Chicago and Miami. KLM slashed transatlantic U.S. flights by up to 45%. Singapore Airlines pulled out of Seattle and Houston. U.S. domestic carriers, too, began contracting. JetBlue exited 15 smaller markets. United cut over 1,200 flights monthly, hitting heartland states like Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri the hardest. Meanwhile, Canada, once eager to repair relations, had moved on. Its airlines rerouted, its travelers rebooked, its airports restructured, and its people, once America's most frequent and forgiving guests, had stopped knocking. The border remained physically open, but psychologically, a wall had been built, brick by bureaucratic brick, laid silently by policy, amplified by perception. What had started as a trickle became a transformation. And now, two nations that once traveled side by side find themselves staring across a runway that grows wider by the day. The Canadian coast, travel industry, feels the chill. In Montreal's historic district, streets that once teemed with American tourists in July now echoed with emptiness. Souvenir shops trimmed operating hours. Hotel lobbies sat eerily quiet. For Canada's $104 billion tourism industry, the summer of 2025 wasn't just disappointing, it was disruptive. While the majority of attention focused on Canadians pulling out of U.S. trips, the lesser-known impact was the reverse flow, the sharp drop in American tourists visiting Canada. With Canada's U.S.-facing advertising suspended and the rising cost of cross-border travel due to U.S. airline cuts and fewer package deals, inbound American tourism declined nearly 15%. That loss hit hard in border regions, from Niagara Falls to British Columbia's ski resorts, where U.S. visitors once made up nearly 70% of seasonal revenue. For Air Canada, the hit was direct. The airline slashed its U.S. operations by 40%, resulting in quarterly losses and a dividend cut from 98 cents to 60 cents. Airports like Calgary and Ottawa reduced terminal staffing. Ground transportation companies canceled seasonal hires. Even cruise lines adjusted. Atlantic Canada, which depended on American passengers docking from New England ports, saw cruise arrivals drop by 28%, according to the Port of Halifax. Smaller Canadian businesses bore the brunt. One Toronto-based tour operator, specializing in dual-country itineraries, reported a 65% cancellation rate for summer bookings. Our entire model relied on cross-border flow, the company's spokesperson told CBC. Now we're pivoting to EU-bound travel and hoping we can rebuild. The tourism gap is beginning to force structural shifts. Canadian airlines are doubling down on Asia and Europe. Provinces are issuing grants for domestic travel initiatives. But the loss of American volume isn't easily replaced. It was convenient, predictable, and profitable. And in places like Vancouver and Quebec City, empty rooms and canceled tours echo with a painful truth. When ties unravel silently, recovery isn't just about routes. It's about trust. The American blowback, cities left bleeding. In Las Vegas, the slot machines still blink, but fewer coins are clinking. Canada's 70% reduction in US-bound tourism translated into a seismic shockwave across major American cities, and the numbers tell the story. New York alone expects to lose roughly 2 million foreign visitors in 2025, with Canadian travelers comprising the largest drop. The estimated loss, $4 billion in tourism spending. At JFK Airport, gate activity is down nearly 28%. In terminal restaurants, workers report empty lunch rushes. Taxi stands that once snaked with passengers now have idle cabs lined around the block. The crisis rippled westward. In Orlando, Disney World cut park hours and suspended fireworks shows on weekdays. Canadian families, traditionally one of the most reliable summer demographics, were gone. Hotel occupancy plummeted 34% in Orange County. Smaller hotels began consolidating floors, laying off cleaning and reception staff. In Miami, the nightlife industry faced a particularly sharp blow. International spending at clubs, bars, and entertainment venues fell 31% in Q2. "We built a city for global guests," one club owner told the Miami Herald, "but now it feels like the world left." The airline industry suffered a dual blow. While Canadian carriers cut flights, US-based airlines like Delta and United saw corresponding route contractions. JetBlue's exit from 15 smaller airports disproportionately affected rural communities already reeling from inflation and sluggish post-pandemic recovery. Retailers in border towns like Buffalo, Detroit, and Bellingham saw store traffic fall off a cliff. Gas stations, outlets, and restaurants, many dependent on Canadian day trippers, now face existential crises. Even state governments noticed. Florida's tourism tax revenue dropped by nearly $620 million in the first half of 2025. Nevada's gaming tax projections missed targets by 14%. The irony? Many of these regions are strongholds of the same populist politics that cheered the policies behind this retreat. Now, with empty resorts and fading profits, they're learning the hard way. When visitors vanish, so does prosperity. A silent chasm now stretches across the world's longest undefended border. There was no treaty broken, no summit walked out on, just flight cancellations, vacant hotel rooms, and two countries watching each other through frosted glass. What began as a political flex has spiraled into an economic bleed, leaving airports underused, tourism economies shaken, and long-standing trust quietly eroded. Both nations face a choice: restore what was lost, or continue retreating behind the illusion of independence. Because if the US loses its top ally in tourism and Canada loses its closest neighbor in commerce, what remains is a shell of North America unity. Empty terminals, empty beaches, and a shared future suddenly hanging in limbo. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or lose alone trying to go it solo? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.